Good afternoon. My name is Shang-Jin Wei. I do research on cross-border capital flows, exchange rates, global value chains, and almost anything related to the Chinese economy. So I want to talk to you today about the status competition and risk tolerance and economic growth. Now, it's obvious that risk-taking is important for innovation and growth. If no one takes risk, there will be no innovation, and there will be very little growth. What I'm hope to do today is to summarize some of my research on how status competition might affect tolerance for risk, and then provide some estimate of implication for growth. In the existing literature, it has been documented that sometimes portfolio managers, their tolerance for risk can be affected by a particular type of status competition related to competition in the marriage market, or thinking about one's status in the marriage market. For example, the existing literature shows that a single male portfolio manager tends to take less diversified portfolio than a married male. So kind of interesting. And then changing marital status apparently also affects the risk profile of the portfolio. So very interesting research. One of the challenge with that the author interpret that as concern for one's relative status in the marriage market affects risk. If you take risk, there's a chance in expectation that you can make more money. That could make yourself more attractive to potential dating partners, marriage partners, and so on. One of the challenges, of course, is it's very difficult to empirically observe and quantify the extent of a status competition. And if you see a correlation like in the story I was just describing, one has to be sure that the only thing that differentiates a single male portfolio versus a married male portfolio or female portfolio managers is difference in concern for status. But there may be reasons why some people are married, other people are not married. That will complicate the interpretation of the story. So that's not the route I'm going to take. Instead, so in my research with Xiaobo Zhang, we're still going to focus on this question. Our innovation is to look for some indicator for variations in status competition that hopefully will be a bit more exogenous and more reliable. And our choice of an indicator for status competition is the ratio of young men to young women. Okay, so that's essentially the part one of the idea. Now, part two of the idea, of course, what do you do with this? Because in most countries, United States, for example, by and large, the ratio of young men to young women is 1. That's true for most countries. But there are some exceptions. So it turns out quite a few countries, mostly in East Asia, but not just in East Asia, so China, India, Vietnam, Korea, and so on, in the last decade or so, are exhibiting an unusual feature in the dating market, which is that there's been a surplus of young males. And in fact, the surplus has been rising over time. So China is an extreme example of this. Before 2002, if you look at the age cohort between 15 to 30, let's say, the ratio of male to female is essentially 1. But starting around 2002, this ratio has been rising progressively. 2, today, the ratio is 1.15 young men per 1 young woman. 1.15 doesn't sound like a very large number. But this implies, this ratio implies that approximately 1 out of every 9 young men cannot mathematically find a girlfriend or wife or a long-lasting partner. So that's the implication of 1.15. If you look at the Chinese movie or TV, you see a crowd of young men. You don't know which one has no girlfriend or wife, but you can be sure, statistically speaking, 1 out of 9 won't be able to have a mating partner. The immediate consequence of this, of course, is it becomes much tougher for young men to find girlfriend or wife, and it becomes much tougher for parents with a young son to successfully have a daughter-in-law. So that's the immediate consequence. And this in turn will lead to a set of behavioral responses. That's going to be the focus of our research. And this set of behavioral responses will all be motivated by a desire to accumulate wealth. Why? Well, because if you think about it, what does it take for one to find a girlfriend or wife? One quickly realize that in essentially all countries, all cultures, and throughout the history, wealth is very useful comparative weapon in the dating market, the marriage market. Virtually no wealthy man will have trouble finding a girlfriend. This is not a statement about anything, just essentially empirically that seems to be the case. Because of that, one can potentially observe a set of behavioral responses to tighten the marriage market, increase the need to compete in the marriage market through wealth. One might see rising savings rates. One might see greater supply of work effort. And most importantly, for the 20 minutes I have today, one might see more willingness to tolerate risk, because taking risk, if it gives you higher return, is something that now people, either a given person is more willing to do, or more people will be willing to do. And this one particular a special case of taking more risk is perhaps more people will be willing to be entrepreneurs, to be business owners. Starting a firm is a riskier activity with high expected returns. We might also see an increased demand for status goods, anything that potentially can demonstrate or signal one's relative wealth. So a special example of this is demand for housing can go up. Housing is, for most families, is a big component of wealth, and relative to most other components of wealth, it's relatively visible, relatively verifiable. Hence, that could also be a behavioral response one might see. So that's part one of the story. Part two of the story is this, there could be spillover. So the part one of the story is about how young men or parents with an unmarried son may respond to this change in the marriage market status competition. Part two of the story is what do other people do in response to that? Now, one's immediate thought would be, if I have no son, no daughter, I don't have to respond to that. Or if I have a daughter, or if I'm a young woman, I might view a rise in male-female ratio as a favorable shock to me. I may take advantage of this. I might feel right. If my future husband-to-be is going to be wealthier than otherwise the case, maybe I don't have to sacrifice as much to study very hard, sacrifice leisure, work very hard, and so on. So that's very natural intuition. Our research suggests that that may be true, but there can also be offsetting incentive to that. That's not the only thing that could happen to people other than young son, other than a family with a son. And we talk about a few channels through which this can be undone. But let me mention one or two. So suppose I have no children whatsoever. I don't have to directly concern about, but I'm married, so I don't have to be concerned with marriage market per se. But if my neighbor, my cousin, my colleagues, because they have son, they start to accumulate more wealth, they start to buy a bigger house and live in a nice house, they might generate utility loss for me, because I'm concerned with my status. So the fact that other people are accumulating more wealth could cause psychological trauma to me. And therefore, my optimal response may very well be also to work harder, longer, to accumulate more wealth, to buy bigger house, comparable and at least not too much worse than my neighbors or my friends, right? So a classic American saying is, a rich man is one who's richer than his brother-in-law. Is there such a saying? Something like that. So, so you go to family Thanksgiving dinner, you don't want to be the poorest person at dinner. So that's a spillover, potential spillover to other families. But there can be other channels. For example, if I have a daughter, even though rising sex ratio increases the chance of my daughter finding a mate, no problem. But I care about quality of a mate. I know, as a father of a daughter, I know that rising sex ratio makes most men to try to work harder, accumulate more wealth. Therefore, the distribution of wealth for my potential, son-in-law has shifted to the right. Which means that now the richest young man is also much richer than it used to be the case when sex ratio was balanced. So I'm going to ask myself, what does it take for my daughter to be considered relatively attractive than her competitors by that very wealthy young man? If other things equal, men also prefer, other things equal is important, also prefer, woman coming from a wealthy family, then my optimal response may very well, rather than just free riding, reduce my effort, may very well to increase my effort, to increase my wealth level, therefore to increase the chance that my daughter can be matched with the best possible man. So that's another channel that would at least partially offset the free riding incentive. Now, if you put those things together, if more people are willing to supply labor, raising savings rates, and trying to be entrepreneurs, putting those things together, this has a natural implication for economic growth. You're going to have a faster rate of economic growth than otherwise the case. Okay, so this is our story. So this story, how much extra growth we will get is something one can obviously econometrically estimate. Now, this story naturally implies a bunch of potentially falsifiable but also verifiable implications. For example, do we see more household savings in response to increasing sex ratio or not? Do we see more supply of labor or not? More people willing to tolerate risk? More entrepreneurs coming out of increase the sex ratio or not? And what do we see more economic growth or not? And do we see increased demand for status products, status goods or not, including rising housing prices or not? Given the time, I'm going to argue that in fact, that's the kind of thing I've been obsessed with in the last 4 years. I spent 50% of my research time thinking about those questions. But today I'm going to highlight essentially perhaps just 3 things. Some evidence on tolerance for risk, some evidence on entrepreneurship, and evidence on economic growth. I refer you to other papers I have that documenting other channels. But one other thing maybe I should highlight is, I think is also interesting, is that that one of the testable implications of the story is that why through extra work, extra risk-taking, people may, on average, earn more money, accumulate more wealth, but simultaneously, people's happiness can decline. Okay, so that's something that the literature calls immeasurizing growth. That's something that I'm documenting right now. But I'm not going to be able to cover all of them. So I'm only going to mention a subset of this. What I want to note is that this effect of a status competition on risk tolerance, on economic growth, is not restricted to society with a unbalanced sex ratio. So even with balanced sex ratio, the same effect can still be there, right? To the extent not all mating partners are homogeneous, some are better than others, you want to compete to make yourself more attractive than your competitors. So qualitatively, the same effect is there. It's just that quantitatively, of course, the strength of the effect is not the same. But more importantly, in terms of research, in terms of empirical testing, it's much harder to discover that effect when you don't see variation in concern for status. But the effect is can still be there. So here's a list of some of the things already released, either published or released as a working paper. On the first paper is on effect of sex ratio on savings rate. The second is effect of sex ratio on current account and real exchange rate. And the third is on effect on housing prices. So let me give you some evidence, basic facts. So I'm going to focus on, even though unbalanced sex ratio is observable in many, many economies by now. I'm going to focus on China, given the time and given this is the economy that I have a bit more careful research. There has been a rising ratio of young men to young women, as I just said before. It's caused by a confluence of three factors: parental preference for sons, technology shock. So in this case, technology shock means the spread of a machine or device that allow parents to detect gender of a fetus relatively easily. In practical terms, this means ultrasound beam machine. So that started to come to developing countries around the early 1980s. By now, most developing countries have this technology widely available. Very inexpensive technology to detect the gender of a fetus. The combination of the first two already can produce selective abortions. That's what the sort of proximate cause for sex ratio imbalance is selective abortions. If you get parental preference for sons, if you get a technology that allows parents to select gender of a fetus and abort a child they don't want, typically girls, you get sex ratio imbalance. That's why you see this in many, many economies. China greatly strengthened the imbalance by also having a government policy, which is commonly known as a one-child policy. It's not exactly accurate description of the policy, but it's a very, very restrictive policy on how many children a couple can have. So confluence of these three factors give you sex ratio imbalance. One slide on evidence on savings. So we have evidence both for the country as a whole in terms of time series patterns across different regions and at household level. So let me just describe using one line each on national evidence and on household evidence. National evidence, so this picture on the left presents two lines. The red line is national savings profile, and the blue line is a sex ratio for youth cohort. Both lines are standardized. The picture, the two lines go together. Some of my friends says he believed my story after seeing this picture. Of course, we cannot stop there because no referee will let us pass just by presenting this picture. So therefore, we have to have some other evidence. But let me just mention evidence on the household level data. Our story has one particular testable implication, which is about the interaction term. A combination of having an unmarried son at home and living in regions with above average level of sex ratio imbalance will give households particularly strong incentive to save. Okay? That's something one can test. Now, the country as a whole has a surplus male problem, and that's virtually true for most regions. There's no region, virtually no region in China now has balanced sex ratio, but the extent of imbalance is uneven. This is what gives us a chance to check. But this interaction term implies that not just that family with other things equal, family with a son would save a bit more than family with a daughter, but if you just compare family with a son with other family with a son, if they have identical income, wealth, occupational profile, education, and so on and so forth, they could still have different savings rate. If family one happens to live in a region with higher sex ratio imbalance, therefore tougher competition for their sons, you tend to see higher savings rate. And you go to the data, you find this prediction being verified. So that's a slide on savings. A slide on work effort. We know a lot of media report about China being the factory of the world, and the factory of the world is manned by many, many migrant workers from a rural area. Now, being a migrant worker in China is a tough thing to do anywhere in the world, but especially tough in China because the government regulation is such that most migrant workers tend to go on their own. They have to leave their spouse or children behind. So it's very, very tough thing to do. Here are some pictures of how migrant workers typically live their life. Now, so last weekend was Chinese New Year. So when major holidays come, migrant workers can choose to go back home. Some may choose to go back home for 2 or 3 days and then go back to their old factories. Others may choose to stay home for 1 week or 1 month and so on. There can be variations in how much effort people choose to supply. This is sort of the basis of our data variation. Household surveys, helpfully to us, ask people, of the last 12 months, how many days have you spent away from home to work in the cities? And there's a lot of variations. A testable implication of our story, again, is this interaction term. So households with an unmarried son coming from a region with more skewed, more unbalanced sex ratio should be expected to supply more labor. So in a Tobit regression, we verify that prediction that my households, head of households, are much more likely to supply more days of work, tolerate more hardship if this interaction term holds. A slide on evidence on risk tolerance. Now, not all jobs are equal. I'm talking about, not talking about business owners, still sort of low-skill labor supply. Some jobs are intrinsically riskier, intrinsically more unpleasant, but presumably carry a bit higher market clearing wage. So what are those jobs? We define jobs that are intrinsically dangerous and risky as jobs in mining, in construction, jobs with exposure to extreme heat, extreme cold, or toxic and hazardous material. Mind you, working in Chinese mines is no catwalk. An annual fatality rate in Chinese coal mining is about 3,000. That's 100 times more dangerous than working in a US coal mine. So here we ask the question, what kind of people are more likely to be willing to take a job like this? We have many testable things one can look at, but one of them is also this interaction term. Do people coming from households with a young son, unmarried son at home, and living in a region with very unbalanced sex ratio, are they more willing to take such a risk? Okay, so a probability regression allows to test this. So what we find is indeed this interaction term is confirmed. That is, so again, it's not just that family with a son tend to be more willing to take risk than family with a daughter. And people who take risks are not just males, can be father or mother of young son, or can be young men themselves. But again, if you just compare family with a son with another family with a son, you have different willingness to take risk depending on their home, local marriage market situation. So that's a slide on this. A slide on entrepreneurship. Okay, so here's we explore variation in sex ratio across regions. So horizontal axis give you ratio of young men to young women, and the vertical axis measures entrepreneurship by rate of increase in the newly formed privately owned firms. So that's our proxy for entrepreneurship. And there's a striking positive association between the two. That is, regions with more skilled sex ratio tend to give you a lot more supply of new entrepreneurs. And you can worry about various kind of econometric issues. Needless to say, I want to claim that we can address all of those questions very convincingly and successfully. If you have any doubt, check out the working paper. Let me just conclude with a slide on economic growth. What is the general equilibrium effect? Now, I give you stories about how if greater concern for status competition leads to a more supply of labor, more willingness to take risk, and more entrepreneurship, these are all pro-growth forces. But logically, one can also imagine that status competition leads to anti-growth factors. For example, maybe greater status competition can lead more people to be criminals, to commit crimes. Why? In a way, you may never have heard about this before, but here's something that worth considering. Being a criminal and being entrepreneurs share a lot of similarities. Both are high risk and high expected return activities, right? But if more people choose to be criminals, and our colleague Lena Ederden and her co-authors show some evidence of that, criminality could discourage investment. That there will have a negative impact on growth. Hence, it's important to ask the general equilibrium effect, question. What is the net effect of greater concern for status competition triggered by sex ratio increase on economic growth? So that's what we do, the last thing I want to show you. And if you do that, you will discover that the net effect is clearly and strongly positive. For the Chinese case, we estimate that for the sex ratio induced status competition has generated 2 percentage points extra growth every year for the last 10 years. So that counts for roughly 20% of Chinese growth rate. That is, without the extra status competition story presented here, Chinese growth rate would have been 8% a year. It's pretty miraculous, but not as unusual as the 10% growth rate that we see. Thank you very much. Let me stop here.